conquest of the Aztecs from a native perspective by reading books such as Broken Spears. Now, this book contains writings by indigenous intellectuals on their perspective of the conquest of the Aztecs. Now, aside from that, you have to remember, during the colonial period in Nueva España, colonial Mexico, 90% or more of the Spanish imperial armed forces were also Native American. And indigenous intellectuals from these various allied towns also wrote their own documents, oftentimes in indigenous languages. You know, one of the biggest problems with history in Latin America is everything is so politicized. It really takes years of study to peel back all the layers to get something approximating the truth. Let's look at Hispanic history in North America. We get three very different visions of history. Let's compare the historiography of New Mexico, Mexico, and Texas. Among Hispanic people in New Mexico, you see a romanticized past as well as a historical memory of conflict with Native Americans, as well as peaceful relations with Native Americans. Did you know that the language of the Aztecs was one of the official languages of Mexico for most of the Spanish colonial period? That's right. Starting in the 1500s, it was Nahuatl, not Spanish, that was the official language in indigenous communities across Mexico, which back then was known as New Spain. At the time, Nahuatl was already the most widely spoken language in the colony. Government documents, history books, school material, religious texts, and many other things were written in Nahuatl. Many other languages, such as Purépecha and Zapotec, had official status at the local level. Did you know that being Catholic was a requirement of Mexican citizenship until 1857, which was long after the country became independent in 1821? Interestingly, the Mexican War of Independence was not actually against the King of Spain or the Catholic Church. In fact, even after independence, Mexico's independence leaders offered the King of Spain to rule over Mexico as an independent country.
Hello, Buelna News viewers. This is Gabriel Buelna, your host of Buelna News. We haven't seen you for a few months. We've been busy. Most of you know that I'm an attorney and involved in politics here in Los Angeles. In fact, go to buelnanews.com, but also visit buelnalaw.com. And if you want to know about any of the stuff that I'm doing with regard to the laws, family law, criminal law, and related to being a trustee at the LA community colleges. Also, for those of you visiting the first time, press subscribe down there. Join us. Look at the rest of the interviews. Today we have a guest. His name is Tokyo Drifter.
Hey.
How you doing, Tokyo?
Great. I'm just turning off my phone so I don't get any random calls at the wrong time. Great.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. Before we start, can you tell us where you got the name Tokyo Drifter?
So in college, I actually studied in Japan, and I speak Japanese relatively fluently. And I used to live in Tokyo, so I just picked it up as a username.
So on TikTok, on Buelna News, most of you know that we've interviewed several individuals who are popular on TikTok. And our main focus is Mexican Chicano populations. Tokyo, of those terms, which I always like asking people, what term do you generally like to call yourself in terms of ethnicity? What do you prefer? I always like to be respectful.
Mexican American or Hispanic is
okay. Yeah. Got it. All right. So in terms of you're on TikTok. Tell us, and we're going to get into and I want you to share with us, because I want your audience, as they're viewing your TikTok, to use this as a way of learning about you. And some of those of you who know me by now understand that I have guests who I disagree with, agree with, and I found your TikTok fascinating because some of them I'm like, what in the world is he doing? Some of it I'll agree with, and some of it I'm like, but what's interesting is that it's different. And I think earlier you said it's off the beaten path.
Yeah.
It's a narrative. It's commentary. And when people are doing when other Mexican Americans, I'm Mexican American, are doing something like this, I tell folks, you don't have to 100% agree with what people are doing. if you find it unique, if you find it interesting. And so I found your TikTok interesting because you're doing a genealogy. As soon as I think you're going down this path, you go down another path, and I'm like, well, where does he stand on this? So we'll talk about some of that, but can you tell us about your journey on TikTok, on YouTube, and why you started and how's it going for you?
So I actually stumbled on the idea to focus on Mexican history and genealogy. Like a lot of people on TikTok, I started using it when COVID started, and just because it was the new hip thing, so I got on. And I haven't really ever been big on social media. I've never really had a personal Facebook page or anything like that. I just got on TikTok, and I thought, oh, it'd be nice to make a video of me and my son speaking Japanese together, because it's kind of unique. My son speaks a little Japanese, and I speak Japanese relatively fluently. So I made a couple of videos of me and him doing skits in Japanese. And, I got a pretty good reception right away. And then one day I did a video on Mexican history, and it really took off. It really, really took off. And I've always been into Mexican history forever. Like, I've studied it very thoroughly, probably since I was like 11 years old. And I've been involved in genealogical work in Mexico, archival preservation and stuff like that through the Hispanic Heritage Project. And so I made a video on Mexican history, and that really took off. And if you've noticed on TikTok, there are a lot of Hispanic creators. Our population is relatively young. The average Hispanic American is, I think, like 28 years old or something like that. So, I mean, there's a very, very young population of people between teenage years and 20s and 30s. So people have taken off on TikTok, and it's given an avenue for young people to express themselves, and it's also given a chance for creators to come up. And so I'm older than that age range, but when I started posting videos, a lot of those young people supported me, and my account got pretty big for just focusing on history and genealogy and archives, stuff that some people might seem as boring.
Now, I think I'm a Chicano Studies a faculty member at Cal State Northridge, along with a few other things, and you've been critical of some folks in my profession, in my discipline. Am I right?
Yeah, and believe me, I went through the whole Chicano Studies circuit. I've gone through. I took classes in college in Chicano, and there's nothing wrong with the department itself. I mean, I had a lot of personal growth while going through those classes, but some of it is it's a little political, and I think it's a lot of activism these days where people activists or institutions think they're challenging narratives when in reality they're repeating narratives. And so I've gotten a little bit critical on that. I mean, there's other, not too critical, but there's other stuff that's happening in Chicano Studies where, stuff around Olmecs and the history of the Olmecs so I do have criticism of traditional academic departments, but I think that's just part of the debate that is healthy for our community.
Well, it's interesting because as a Chicano Studies professor, I've always thought that you have to invite folks, even if their narrative or story isn't necessarily what you consider 100% with you, right? Which to a certain extent, it's a little irrelevant, which is frankly more interesting,
Right.
more interesting. But in order to prepare for this interview, and I'll tell you, your interview was preparing for this interview was a little complicated because your TikToks are a little everywhere, right? Starting with how you use the term Hispanic, right? In looking across your TikToks, you seem to use, and some people might say, well, that's irrelevant. It's important. Well, I think, someone like you cares about how you use terminology. Sometimes you'll say Hispanics when you mean individuals from Spain, but in the United States, the context of Hispanic doesn't mean that. It means everyone from Latin America. So I'm curious to say why use, instead of sometimes in a TikTok, you'll say Spaniards and Hispanics in one sentence. And why do you do that?
So the word Hispanic, even on the U.S. Census, it does include people from Spain. It's
correct. Yeah.
The totality of the community of Spanish speakers. And so when I use Hispanic, I'm talking about specifically Hispanicized people. So if you see me do a video on, let's say, the conquest of the Philippines, when I say Hispanic people, I'm talking about the Spaniards, the Criollos, the mixed people who were part of that expedition. And if I say indigenous people, I'm talking about Tlaxcalans, like the non-Hispanicized people. Because you have to remember, in colonial times, indigenous people still spoke their languages. So the Tlaxcalan people still spoke Nahuatl. And so, I mean, essentially, they were not Hispanic people. They were indigenous people. And so I'm just using it in that context.
Right. And I get that part, but I'm more talking about the post 1970 use of the term Hispanic, right? And I'm not saying, look, and part of the discussion for those of you who are listening isn't about whether, you know, to use Hispanic, Latino, or any other terms. It's just about diving into to drifters, TikToks, and the use of terminology, not as a critique, but simply it's interesting. In terms of how it's used.
So the basic use of it is it's the community of Spanish speakers. And so a lot of my work focuses on the colonial period, right? And so, you know, during the colonial period in Mexico, there were about 70 Spanish cities. And so these cities were, you know, places like Guadalajara, Morelia, back then it was called Valladolid, San Luis Potosí. Those 70 cities are where the Hispanicized or just, you know, outright Hispanic people lived. And then the rest of Mexico was about 4,000 indigenous towns. And so it's important to distinguish between those two things because these people live very different lives.
One of the books, and we're going to put up the title right now, that I like, one of the authors that I like reading is Laura Gomez, and she has a book called Manifest Destinies. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you've run into the book. But she's out of UCLA, UCLA Law School, and also Chicano Studies professor. But she talks about the concept of for Mexican Americans with regard to double colonization. That, you know, because I told someone that I was going to have an interview and we're going to talk about colonization. And they were like, "Oh my God, you're into that subject again." Well, I said, if you look at the TikToks, everyone has every TikTok has the term, you know, the colonial period, i.e. colonization. And when you're talking about Mexican Americans, you're talking about an American. You're talking about the way some will look at the American takeover of the Southwest and language and race as another form of colonization. So for Mexican Americans, a kind of another level of colonization. And you having a background in Chicano studies, how you go over the facts of colonization, but I'm not hearing you do the analysis of the effects of colonization in Mexico, because Mexican colonization, and for Mexican Americans as well. And I wanted to get your thought on that.
I mean, I think I do cover the effects of colonization. Essentially, in the construction of Mexico, in the bedrock of what modern Mexico is today, it's Mesoamerica, right? That's the sort of heartland of ancient Mexican culture, but then also there's an added layer of Nueva España. You have to remember when we say Mexico or Mexico, we're talking only about an island in central Mexico. That was
Mexico Tenochtitlan.
Right. That was an island. And Tenochtitlan was the city on the island. And so the island itself was Mexico. And so outside of that island, that's where we find in central Mexico the Aztec Empire. And so when that was conquered, that essentially ceded over to the Spanish monarchy. And that's all that existed in the beginning, at the very beginning of colonization. And so when we look at the Yucatan Peninsula or northern Mexico, that is an expansion of essentially central Mexican culture. And so when we look at cities up north, and when I'm talking about, you know, the establishment of Albuquerque or Saltillo, that is the effect of colonization on essentially these ancient territories. And so I talk a lot about that expansion.
But I think we may be talking about different things. When I'm speaking about colonization, I'm thinking, and when you're looking at Spain ultimately, because as an attorney, I'm always thinking jurisdiction, right? Mm-hmm. Spain ultimately took jurisdiction, but that was Spain's decision to take jurisdiction simply because of military conquest. But as we're looking at those of us, all of us, right? You, myself, our likely our families, we've been affected mostly because, and if you disagree with me, that's fine. The American system, we generally talk about race being important, that the centrality of whiteness. And in the colonization by Spain, I don't see the difference between the American. I mean, there's differences in terms of Spanish culture, then British culture, but in terms of the centralization of white racism within the colonial framework. Am I wrong there, or what's your thought?
So when we think of Mexico, we have to remember Mexico, the country, never existed before 1821. Mexico is a modern concept.
But most countries are.
Yeah, and that's fine. But I think a lot of people get they have a sort of misconceived notion of what Mexico is because we named the country after the Aztecs. Essentially we found inspiration in the Aztecs and essentially named the country after that. The founders of Mexico, the people who founded the modern Mexican country, they were not Aztecs. They were not. I mean, I've been hard pressed to find people that can find any indigenous leaders that were involved in, and this is a critique I have of Mexican history. I'm not trying to go in the other direction. This is a critique I have. We have a country called Mexico with no indigenous leaders that were part, and there were indigenous people that were part of the fighting force, but there were no indigenous leaders in this movement. And there were no indigenous leaders in the founding of the country. Most of the founders were Spanish people, like they were Spanish Mexicans, they were criollos. And so essentially they found inspiration in Mexico's ancient past to sort of create legitimacy around the country. But the country itself was founded by mostly European people. And I think in some ways, like, I mean, does Mexico have a moral high ground in this sense? Like, I don't know if neither one, whether we're talking about Nueva España or the founding of modern Mexico, both of them were founded essentially by mostly European people. And I think we have to, that's a criticism that we need to have for ourselves as well, right?
Well, I think what I would say is it a criticism or an observation? It may be the same thing in terms of outcome. The difference being with the United States, which was also founded by a white elite, is right. That at least the country, I mean, not at least, the country of Mexico is mostly a non-white country in terms of its population, in terms of the mix of the population. But I want to go back to the component.
Well, it's a non-white country for sure, right? Because mixed people, by U.S. definitions, are not white people. So by that definition, the majority of Mexico is not a white country. But if you look in terms of the history of politics in any country in the world, not just Mexico. Politics and warfare are usually driven by men, correct? And so the majority of paternal lineages in Mexico are Spanish paternal lineages. And so, 60 to 65% of all men in Mexico descend from Spanish men. So it's a very fascinating phenomenon where most people were raised in Hispanic households for, if we're looking at the totality of people. But most maternal lineages are indigenous, and that's why essentially it's a mixed country. But to just paint it as something that at its core doesn't have any European influence. I think we're being a little disingenuous.
Wait, no, and wait, no, and you wouldn't get that from me. But what I'm getting at, and I've been looking at the kind of the totality of your TikToks, and let me just say, people should follow Drifter. I do. What's called it's a very, very interesting place to be part of. Let me just say. But in looking at the totality of the TikToks, what I'm not seeing is being here in the United States. I'm in Los Angeles. Wherever you're at. There's a discussion of race, whether it's healthy, unhealthy. Within Mexican society and within the colonial period, I don't see the understanding of how race, because of how the Spaniards looked at in terms of its different caste systems, access to property, access to land, access to the control of the church, that time period and the European experience led to a very, very similar but different approach to race that's occurred here in the United States, where white skin and European privilege got you access to resources, got you access to more schools, university, roads, healthcare, right? So we're Mexicans in Mexico are living that, and to a certain extent, Mexicans in the United States, but I'm not hearing that understanding, and maybe that's not your understanding on your TikTok, and I think by maybe not focusing on that, some of your users maybe not getting the full experience of what you're trying to do, or maybe you just completely disagree.
So I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of what happened in Mexico during the colonial period. So I understand the concept of the caste system and stuff like that, and I think if anything, I think the caste system, when the popular conception of it, I think that's more of a reality of modern Mexico than what happened during the colonial period. I mean, certainly it originated like that. The caste system is something we describe as a layering of society where there's like Spanish people at the top, mixed people in the middle, and then Black and indigenous people at the bottom. That is something that occurred in Spanish cities, like as a result of laws that happened. There wasn't, it wasn't something like, oh, these people are untouchable or something like that. What happened was, in the very beginning, there were no mixed people, like, right? I mean, eventually, if you do your genealogy long enough, your paternal lineage will go back to an indigenous man or a Spanish man. That's really, like, when you do genealogy, that's really at the heart of it. Like, where do your lineages go back to? And in the beginning, there were no mixed people. The mixed people sort of occurred despite the laws that were created. There was really no incentive to create mixed families during the colonial period, but people just sort of, it occurred. Now, under Spanish laws at that time, and when I say Spain, Spain's also a sort of modern country. I'm talking about the Spanish monarchy, really. Mm-hmm. But under those laws at the time, there were only two groups that had the right to self-government, and that was indigenous people. They had their own governing status, and Spanish people. And so these laws were written from afar, right? These laws were written from people in Spain, and later, as time went on, a mixed race population developed that didn't have certain rights because the legal system was not built for mixed people. The legal system was built for a joint governing of indigenous people and Spanish people. And so that's where you see a lot of disadvantages that happen. But we say caste system to describe that, but it's not like it was something that was codified into law that said, oh, you're an indigenous person, you're an untouchable or something like that. That's not how it worked. We use the word caste system to describe what happened as a result of this dual governing status, where indigenous people had governing rights and Spanish people had governing rights, and mixed race people sort of were excluded from both communities.
But Drifter, let me push back to you here. When you look at modern Mexican society, I'm assuming you've been all over Mexico. I would be shocked if you haven't visited all the states of Mexico. Am I right?
I've been to quite a few of them.
Yeah. If you look at Mexican elite society, and if you look at news, if you look at novelas, you look at power, and it's generally lighter skinned Mexicans who have that. And you simply walk out of those studios, and everyone who's walking around is brown. I mean, so it's hard to not look at the colonial period. And because most people have a sense of you can fix things in 1 or 2 generations. And I'd say nothing has ever told us that it takes hundreds of years to fix issues that we have, right? So as I'm looking at, like, for instance, the analysis that you just gave right here, I'm not getting, and again, if I'm wrong, I'm not getting that you fully grasp the effect of that system and how it affected the Mexican mind today and the Chicano mind.
Let me go ahead and expand on that. Okay. When I say the caste system is more a reflection of modern day society than anything else, let me elaborate on that. Mm-hmm. So this in colonial times, indigenous people and Spanish people and mixed race people essentially lived in separate communities, like people who spoke Spanish. Okay. So Afro-Hispanic people, mixed race people between, mestizo and Spanish people lived in about 70 cities in Mexico. They were not the majority of the population. The other, 60% of the population, about 90% of them lived in their own communities. They were not like under the heel or living in shanty towns in Guadalajara. They lived literally in separate towns, and they had land grants, and they had their own governing rights. They had what was called Repúblicas de Indios. And that essentially refers to a type of city council that they had. And only indigenous people could sit on those city councils. And all of those towns had land grants associated with them. So 90% of indigenous people had land. They had communal land rights. And what happened after independence is Mexico abolished those self-governing rights and abolished those land grants. And Mexico tried to assimilate indigenous people into Hispanic culture. And that's why you see in 1810, 60% of the population spoke an indigenous language. And what's that percentage now? 5%? So what happened after independence is these 70 cities essentially tried to assimilate those other 400 towns. And ultimately they did, because most of the population speaks Spanish and they're mixed. And that's essentially what the Mexican government set out to do. And that's what it did. And so that's why I say, yes, there were significant racial disadvantages in the colonial period that existed in those 70 Spanish cities, because those cities were designed for Spanish people. And there were some race-based aspects of it, and it did disadvantage people. But what Mexico did after independence was they essentially expanded that culture, the idea of Hispanicizing people and assimilated them. Mexico did that after independence.
So let's just say, for instance, it's an interesting conversation. If you were back in 1821, right, with let's say the drifter effect, what do you think now, Monday morning quarterbacking 200 years ago, right? What would you have done? What would you have? And by the way, this is us saying, understanding what you just said, because you also in your TikTok said, well, after independence, the Spaniard or the Hispanic, as you call them, in towns weren't broken up, right? It was just the indigenous groups.
Correct.
Right. So, but what should have Mexico have done? And here's a reason for talking about this, because I'm still in the belief that we're still dealing with this. Even as Mexican Americans north of the border, we're within that area that was affected by this in either way, right? Wherever you live and me here in Los Angeles. So what should they have done that would have affected us today? Because it goes to potential public policy today.
So let's talk about what's happening now, and then we'll work backwards.
Yeah.
So there are actually indigenous people, actually, people who still hold on to their culture, their language, their sense of community all over Mexico. And they're in Mexican courts suing for the Mexican government to recognize their land grants that were issued by the King of Spain. And that's essentially, there are land grants that go back to the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Even the Pueblo Indians, they took the United States to the Supreme Court to have their land grants recognized, and in the 1930s. And so that also happened in the United States. And the United States did recognize their land grants that were issued by the King of Spain. And so Mexico abolished those after the 1850s. Mexico severely curtailed the rights of communal land grants. And so now indigenous people are left basically fighting on their own for recognition of this. And the problem is a lot of people don't talk about this. When you talk to people who they're socially minded, people who really care about indigenous rights, when you try to explain to them that they did have land during the colonial period and it was taken away after independence, people kind of look at you in disbelief. And so I think if we really cared about indigenous land rights, we would look back at what they're actually fighting for. And if I were around maybe in 1821, I would have said to people in that time to respect indigenous rights because that was their community. Now, when Mexico abolished those land grants, those people had nowhere else to go. They had nowhere else to go. They were not living people blur the lines between the Mexican Revolution and Mexican, like the colonial period. They think like everybody was just living and working and, breaking their back on haciendas. 90% of indigenous people lived in their own communities. Yeah, I'm sure that there was like labor exploitation and stuff like that back then. I'm not, there's no whitewashing on that. There was certainly a labor exploitation, but they had land to go back to. And what Mexico did in order to assimilate them into Hispanic society, they eliminated those grants, and those people had nowhere else to go. So they ended up in shanty towns, in bigger cities, in like state capitals. They ended up working on haciendas, the bulk of them. And so, look at what happened. Look what was the result of these terrible, terrible policies. We had the Mexican Revolution. 1 million people died. That was 10% of Mexico's population died in the Mexican Revolution.
10% immigrated to the United States.
Yeah, and that was a war against the Mexican government. That wasn't a war against Spain or Spaniards or whatever. That was a war against the Mexican government. And they eventually toppled their own government because of it. So
there was a Spanish politician who said a few months ago, indigenismo is probably one of the most dangerous ideologies around, right? And Spanish politicians come from the left to the right, right? So is indigenismo, indigenism, the ideology of kind of what you mentioned right now still an outstanding question within Mexican and Mexican American society then?
Well, I don't. Indigenismo is kind of like a loaded word,
right? But let me just say, in its spectrum, right? There is a spectrum of how people view it, right? Just like every ideology, there isn't one indigenismo. So I want to lay that foundation first.
Okay, let me just kind of elaborate how politics works in Latin America. The current president of Mexico is a very good example of this. Politicians, they tend to wrap policies in indigenous rhetoric in order to validate them or to legitimize them.
The Tren Maya, you mentioned.
The Tren Maya, I brought that up on one of my TikToks. So, the Mexican president, he wants to build a train through Mayan indigenous communities, and that's going to impact indigenous lands. And so what does he call the train? He calls the train Tren Maya. And it's a way to legitimize policies that oftentimes have nothing to do with indigenous people or very little to do with it, and has more to do with people living in these big cities, these urban folks, trying to legitimize their own agenda. And I think that, so when we talk about indigenismo, there's a lot of stuff coming out of, places like Mexico City, these other like major cities in Mexico, and, very little representation of actual indigenous people in a lot of these discussions. A lot of it is to advance other agendas. Now, and that's why I say indigenismo itself is a loaded term. And that's why, I think indigenous rights is not necessarily the same thing as
correct. So let me reframe it. There's you've brought up the concept of mixed race, and whenever the concept of mestizaje, mestizo, it's a regular thing, especially since the Mexican Revolution. But some would say that because you had a lot of violence, during the Spaniard period, that of course you had mixing. But there's no reason why, even if you aren't 100%, that indigenousness is not part of you. And what's interesting about Mexican society, because this is where Chicano, Mexican American, Mexicans seem to be the same, is that the whole concept of mestizaje, mixed race, seems to be a regular theme in Mexico, because I'm in Mexico quite a bit as well, and here, but you don't hear it in most countries. In the United States, we're a mixed society. Canada's a mixed society. Every single country in the world is a mixed society. Why is that a bigger theme within your TikTok and your studying? In your studies.
Well, I talk about mixed people, mixed lineages, because most of us are mixed people. That's just a fact.
But isn't that everyone in the world? I mean, there isn't a Ukrainian, a Russian, someone from France, or everyone is this. So why is it specifically something that academics focus on? We're focused on within Chicano studies and within Mexican studies.
Well, I think my interest in the topic is more along the lines of, we come from the result of two very different civilizations, Western civilization and Mesoamerican civilization. And if you have African ancestry, that's a third civilization. And so people don't, especially young people, don't know how to grapple with that. And I feel like there's a lot of people in our community trying to pull them in one direction or the other. There's like indigenismo, like, hey, you can only identify as an Aztec warrior, otherwise you're not a real Mexican, which is completely ridiculous. The Mexica came from two towns in Mexico, Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. Most of us are not Aztecs. That wasn't true in 1821. It wasn't true in 1921. And it's not true now. That is a political ideology. That is not a fact of reality. That is only a political ideology. And so you have people pulling them in that direction. And then you have people, pulling them in a more Eurocentric direction. And what I tell people with my channel is step away from the political narratives and focus on the history of your own family, because all of these political narratives have failed us. And every single one of these narratives, if you follow Mexico's official narrative, it was designed to justify the existence of the Mexican government. If you pick up one of these other ideologies that pull you in one direction, they might tell you to just identify as an Aztec warrior, which is not factually true for probably 90%, 95% of Mexicans. And then and other people telling you to identify only with Spanish ancestry. And I don't do that either. I just lay out the facts and I offer tools for people to study their family history and then construct their own narrative centered on their own family. And I've even put out videos as well saying genealogy is not about color. The descendants of these conquistadors and Spanish settlers and stuff like that, they're not white people. These are not like the descendants of Spanish people. They don't look like Spanish people. They're mixed. And likewise, like I'm partly Purepecha through my great grandmother. I don't look like a pre-1519 Purepecha person either. Like, we're mixed people. We don't look like any of our ancestors. And so, sometimes it feels like we're third partying our own ancestors. It's like you don't feel totally indigenous or totally Spanish. You're like a third person outside of it. Why just help people study and reconstruct the narrative for their own family, to tell the best story they would tell their own kids, something that's empowering, not something that, you're just some, vicious conquistador, or you are a weak, frail Aztec defeated man, like nothing like that. I give you the tools and you create the narrative for your own family that is empowering, and puts you in the driver's seat and centers your own family.
You know, it's interesting because within my family, it's actually never been a discussion in terms of, oh, you know, the Spaniard side, the indigenous side. We're here, we're in the Americas, right? Mexico has developed a narrative, has developed a story, just like Germany has, just like any other country in the world, where the modern state is relatively new in society. Most people think, well, Italy's been a country forever. The boundaries of Italy, you know, keep changing, you know, but when you're in the Americas, we're not in Spain. I mean, you know, as an American society, we're not constantly, the royals, excluding the royals, which seems to be an obsession. We're not constantly obsessed about we're connected to a duke of whatever, right? It seems like yes, we understand that part of the United States, part of American, you know, the legal doctrine, history is connected to England. But within Mexican society, there seems to be a part of Mexican society, a continuous need to want to be connected to Spain. And that part still baffles me. What's your thought?
Well, I don't think most people are like completely preoccupied with being connected to Spain. I think most people just kind of go about their lives and that's it. I think.
But when it comes to race, and a lot of Mexican elite and Chicano elite, they will point to, you know, oh, you know, my great uncle is Spaniard, and we don't do that in American society. We said, you know what, we became independent from England. You know, we're not looking to be connected to, you know, to them. But after that, we got to move on. We got to talk about your next favorite subject, the Tlaxcalans. But I'll let you have the last word on this.
Okay, so I actually disagree with you on that. I think in American society we do focus on lineage a lot, which is why I call myself Mexican American, and you talk a lot about, you know, Chicano
and Mexican American too. Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Right, Mexican American. And, you know, and if you ask any average white American what they are, they'll be like, oh, I'm Italian, I'm German, I'm Irish. So people do have.
They generally say white. I mean, anyway, but I'll.
Yeah. So I don't think it's unique that Mexicans have, you know, find a fascination with their past. I mean, if your last name is Garcia and you're from Jalisco, you might be a little curious of why your family's there and why your last name is Garcia. And it's just, people have a right to be proud of their lineage or their heritage and the history of their town and the history of their family. And I mean, the country's named after the Aztecs. So it's not that we're, you know, it's not like we're not fascinated with the past. We named the country after the Aztecs. And, you know, maybe it might conjure up some interest in people who are say, well, people keep saying I'm Aztec, but I'm not from Mexico City. I'm from, you know, Zamora, Michoacan, and, you know, my family were ranchers. They might have a little fascination with why that is. And people end up finding out that their ancestry is traced back to Spain, or not to Spain, to maybe Portugal or some indigenous community in Mexico. And I think it's totally healthy and totally, I think it's empowering. And it certainly doesn't have to be focused on color, because we're not white people in the traditional sense. We are a mixed people, most of us, not all of us. But it's totally okay to accept the totality of who you are and not have to ground it specifically in Europe or in Mesoamerica. It can be both, and you can feel whole.
By the way, for your TikTok viewers, and I'm hoping that some of them watch this, what do you think from our conversation here? You know, for their sake, right? Because I'm an educator and I always want to figure out how people are learning. What is different from our conversation than you've been able to explain, let's say, on your TikToks, even from our conversations?
Well, I mean, usually it's just me talking on my TikToks, right? So this is a good chance for me to actually have someone ask me about my views on things from an outside perspective. And I think that's been the most fascinating part of this discussion. And I think also it gives me a chance to focus on aspects of these types of conversations that aren't necessarily centered on color. I think we talk a lot of, I think in general conversations about stuff like history and colonialism, it's always centered on color. And I think that there's just much more to that conversation. And I think I've added a lot of that to maybe this discussion or other discussions in other settings.
What's very interesting, and I've learned it through other, because I'm 49 years old, and you keep learning, is the connection between Mexico, Spain, and the American Revolution. I'm not sure most Americans understand that we, meaning you as a Mexican American, me as a Mexican American, and the region had a large effect on the American Revolution. And one character, this is my quiz of you, one character that I know you're going to get this one right, that's important in the American Revolution, that maybe without it the American Revolution would have occurred. So who am I talking about?
Galvez.
Montezuma.
Oh, Montezuma. Yeah, actually, one of his descendants were actually in supported Spanish, the Spanish side that helped the American side.
Right, but and go to Galvez.
And Galvez, he was one of the commanders of the Spanish fleets that took people from Mexico to go help fight against the British in Louisiana.
Right, and that's important because for Mexican Americans and other Latinos to understand, there's been a connection to the founding and to the Republic from the beginning, and right. Your resources at some point were used. And I actually learned that about 6 years ago when I was not in Tucson, in New Mexico, for a conference, and then went to the museum there, and they're talking about the sons and daughters of the American, that members from New Mexico and Albuquerque were members of the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution for what they did. But your TikToks are important to highlight some of those. And,
right.
and if you're a TikToker, you should be listening to Drifter and saying, how, is he right? Is he wrong? And go get your information. But let's get to the Tlaxcalans. So if there's one word other than colonization that I hear from your TikToks, it's Tlaxcalans. So what happened that you connected with the Tlaxcalans? Because I do listen on occasion to AMLO's news conference in the morning, and the Tlaxcalans have been part of the discussion. Why for you? What's there?
So I think the Tlaxcalans are one of the most politicized people in all of Mexican history, and I think it's so Mexico's. And I always tell people, you have to start off from this basis. The national narrative of Mexico is fictional. It's not. Mexico takes the people who authored the national narrative of Mexico. They took things that really happened in history and they have woven together a fictional narrative. And so during the colonial period, up until from 1519 up until the 1760s, 90% or more of all the Spanish forces were indigenous people. And the leading group in that were and always had been the Tlaxcalans. And so they were a very fundamental piece in the construction of what became the Mexican nation. And I think what Mexico has done in its historiography is they've basically written, it's very fascinating because the country itself Mexico, the modern country, was founded by Spanish people. But they've woven this history together where all the conquests were done by Spanish people, and all the atrocities were done by Spanish people, and everything was done by Spanish. And that's just not what the historical facts show. So the Tlaxcalans had a very, very important part of expanding the jurisdiction of Mexico City. And all of northern Mexico was settled by Tlaxcalan people. For the most part, wherever Spaniards built their own cities to live in, because there were no cities there. I mean, there were nomadic tribes and other folks living in the area, but the cities that Spanish people lived in, like Saltillo and stuff like that, like those were built by Spanish people and their indigenous allies. And so in every single city in northern Mexico that's there now, they were built, and alongside them, they had also coexisting communities for allied indigenous communities. And those allied indigenous communities served as essentially the militia that would fight off other nomadic tribes. And so, a big part of that were the Tlaxcalans. And Mexico has completely written these people out of history, and it just blows me away. And so, if you look at the people we hold up as the heroes of Mexican independence, like Miguel Hidalgo, Nicolas Bravo, they're all Spanish people. So we demonize the indigenous people who helped Spanish people, and then we've erased them out of history. And then we celebrate the Spanish people who founded Mexico. And I think the whole conversation just becomes a little fantastical and almost ridiculous.
So since you've been on TikTok, so you have 175,000 fans, what are the critiques that folks have of you, and how have you dealt with that reaction?
So I think people have, because they've been given such an unrealistic narrative of how things unfolded in history. Some people have found those indigenous Spanish alliances a little hard to believe, and it's kind of like it when you unpack it, it doesn't really make sense that it is hard to believe. Mexican independence itself was led by Spanish men for the most part. Mexico's founding father is a Catholic priest. And the people that marched with him were Catholic indigenous militia fighters. And they went out and they set out to, go and topple Mexico City. So what all of us, like the Spanish people were just terrorizing everybody for 300 years. And all of a sudden the indigenous people decided to help them in Mexican independence, to help the descendants of the conquistadors. Miguel Hidalgo was a descendant of Juan de Villaseñor, who was, a major it was part of a major Spanish family in Michoacan. So it's just a completely politicized fictional history. And I always try to remind people when we founded Mexico, indigenous people helped Spanish people to found Mexico. And so even from all of the entire colonial period, indigenous people helped the Hispanic people, mixed race people, Spanish people, construct Nueva España, and then indigenous people helped Hispanic people make the country independent. And it just blows me away that people can't understand that. And I think my TikTok channel has really opened people up to a different way of viewing history itself.
From the point that you started your TikTok to today, has your TikTok, because everything is a learning process. Everything is a learning process. I would be shocked that by the time you began doing your TikToks and now, is there a narrative that you've changed on, that you've evolved from?
I think I've always sort of been this way, but I think I've strengthened my my position in this, that I do not simply view Mexican history as before 1821 and after 1821. I just view the history of families. And so if you look at a lot of my videos I put out, it just talks about one family and their sort of march through history. And Mexico's had several governments. Mexico's had several constitutions. Mexico's been in a perpetual state of civil war. And in 1810, 1821, that was just one part of that. And so if you step away from, let's say, the history of the Republic, and you just look at the history of, let's just say, the Buelna family, you get a much more realistic view of history. And I think I have strengthened my own resolve in that position, that people should step away from these political narratives and just view the history of their family and their hometown in its own unique sense.
So when we started this conversation, I brought up the concept of double colonization. You have the colonization that occurred in Mexico and within the United States. You and I are Mexican Americans. We're speaking English, mostly speaking about Mexican history. How is your work important for Mexican Americans where we generally live? About 90% of us live in the area of that was affected by that great movement that you're talking about. but some on the other side of the border speak indigenous languages in Spanish. On this side of the border, indigenous languages, English and Spanish. So what's for Mexican Americans? What does your work mean for us here?
So
specifically understanding double colonization, if you agree with it, even.
I don't really agree with that
Okay.
sort of view. I think every family in Mexico is very different. So if you are a purely, let's say, Zapotec family in Oaxaca, maybe colonization is a very different experience from other people in Mexico. So in one aspect, indigenous people were part of the colonization process in the sense that they led the art, or they were the bulk of the armies that brought much of what we call Mexico today under the control of Mexico City. So in many ways, indigenous people were part of that experience, a strong part of that experience. And in some ways, indigenous people were the victims of that colonization. If the Spaniards and Tlaxcalans came knocking at your door and you didn't agree with what they were doing, you were not going to have a good time. So I think for indigenous people, there's multiple ways to look at this. But then there's other people that, like my paternal lineage is Spanish. I mean, I'm a mixed person. I have indigenous ancestry through maternal lineage, through great grandmothers and stuff like that. But ultimately, like my last name comes from Spain. My paternal forefathers got off a boat at some point and built the city where my family lived. My family's from Zamora, Michoacan. My ancestors are listed as founders of that city. And so for me to just appropriate a totally indigenous experience and say, oh, I'm a victim of colonization, when my own forefathers built a city they lived in and fought in those wars on behalf of the King of Spain, I think for me to just all of a sudden claim to be a victim, I think that's disingenuous. And I think a big part of what we do in Mexico, because people don't quite know the history of how things unfolded, everybody sort of appropriated that. It's like when everybody becomes an Aztec, no one's an Aztec. And I think we always want to blame somebody else for everything. It's like, oh, that wasn't us, that was the people in Spain. It's like, no, like, my Spanish forefathers built Nueva España, not the people in Spain. Like, the people in Spain are the ones who stayed home. And so I think there's just people just have such a politicized view on everything. And I think it's always, we use these words like colonization as we weaponize these words. And I think some people weaponize these words, the people that shouldn't be weaponizing them. I certainly don't accuse people in Spain of conquering my family or something like that. Like, that was something that happened in my community with my own family, and I am a product of that experience. There were no mixed race people in before 1519 or 1521. Like, we are something that arose out of that experience. We are something that arose out of, these 70 Spanish cities where mixed race people lived alongside their Spanish forefathers and their indigenous foremothers. And I think that some of us, rather than blaming or using these words as weapons, we have to take responsibility. Like, if someone's mad about colonization or the effects of colonization, it's people like me and you have to take responsibility for things and rebuild a broken society.
So going back to thank you. Let me just say, Mexican Americans.
Okay.
So Mexican Americans are 40 million strong in the United States, almost 11 million, 11% of the entire U.S. population. Latinos in general, I think, were like 18%. But specifically, Mexican Americans in this geographic area were a different subset than Mexicans. Mm-hmm. So how does your and I'm assuming that the majority of your viewers
are Mexican
American, right? So how are they? What is your narrative or vision for them in this conversation?
Rather than just looking at themselves as whether they're looking in Mexican history or in the Mexican American experience in the United States, rather than just looking at themselves as passive victims of colonization, view themselves as builders and creators and people who are out there improving their communities. And if they don't like if their local public schools are broken, run for the school board. If you don't like the way your government's run, get involved. But I think people should step away from words like colonization, because I think it grounds us in a very politicized discussion that people try to fit into boxes that they shouldn't be fitting into. And I think that if we step away from the politics of certain things, sometimes politics are not the answer. And sometimes, going into discussions about colonization are not the answer to our problems. Sometimes the answer to our problems is building a successful business in your community, or, volunteering to clean up graffiti in the park or something like that. It'd be a part of the nation building process rather than viewing yourself as a passive victim of colonization.
Right. But I don't disagree with that at all. Right. You and I are doing that, and our great producer here.
Right.
But I think it's fair to say, I'm not sure if you would agree, but I agree with myself, that the narrative that you're talking about is not taught in American schools. Right. It's generally where you're going to get it in Chicano studies classes. That's where you're going to get any base of what or if you're studying abroad, right? So what you're talking about is, I would probably say there aren't that many Chicano studies classes that all your followers have taken a Chicano studies class. So to a certain extent, you're a TikTok Chicano studies professor.
In some ways, yeah.
So what are you trying to teach the audience that is Mexican American about Mexican American studies? That is about them, right? Because you're talking, whether they're born here or whether you're born in San Diego or you're born in Tijuana, you're the same individual. I'm the same as my cousins born in Tijuana, same parents, same everything, right? So what is the message about race, class, even the word you don't like, colonialism? What is the message that you're trying to send us, my daughters? I have 3 daughters, right? What are you trying to tell Mexican Americans? Forget Mexicans for a second, Mexican Americans.
So one is, you can take charge of your own history. You don't have to view yourself as part of some type of collective suffering or some type of collective national narrative. You can simply take charge of your own history, and genealogy is probably the best way to do that. And so one, you can construct your own family identity through those tools, and that can't be hijacked by outside people with agendas. So one, there's that, taking charge of your own history. And then 2, you don't have to view yourself as a passive victim of colonization. You could step away from the narrative altogether. You can be a builder. You can improve your communities. There's a lot of things you have power in that you just have to exercise. And also, I think that sometimes solutions to our communities are not necessarily political solutions. Sometimes you just have to go out there and build your own institutions. I take a lot of inspiration from immigrants, actually. If you go to, I live in a primarily Hispanic area. All the businesses are owned by Hispanic immigrants, right? The grocery stores, restaurants, local tax places. All of these institutions are built by immigrants who are not fed narratives from American public schools. They haven't bought into they're focused on their own families and their own institutions and their own communities. And I think for a lot of us, we can get a lot of inspiration from our own immigrant relatives and neighbors and friends. And I think sometimes we, as Mexican Americans, we think that politics is always a solution. And I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case.
Right. So, can you tell us about upcoming TikToks? Then I'll have one final question. So, what should we be looking for?
So I have to do a part 3 on the essentially the conquest of Texas from Mexico. And I've done part 1 and part 2, and I have to do part 3. So it's going to kind of close the loop on the story of Texas. And so that's going to be a good one. The last one I put out had, over 40,000 likes and probably hundreds of thousands of views. So that one did really well. And it's a popular topic. So I'm going to continue on with that. I might focus more on the whole land grants issue, because I think that's a big topic that it's been so written out of Mexican history. It's the fact that everybody focuses on the caste system, which is something that happened in 70 Spanish cities, when in reality there were 4,000 indigenous towns where Spanish people didn't live. And so it's convenient that the historiographers had just taken that out of the history, because it tells a different story than what the national official narratives had told. And so I want to bring that more to the surface, so people know that there is a struggle for indigenous land grants that are still happening in Mexico. And so, yeah.
So I know I said one final question, but I always do that. If you're a TikToker and you're listening to this conversation, how is this conversation? How could TikTokers use this conversation to expand their understanding of you as a TikToker, as an educator, as a Chicano studies professor? Then the final word to you.
I think, I have a very simplistic view on this. I'm just somebody trying to give people tools, and I'm trying to empower people. And I find genealogy to be a very empowering way to help people depoliticize or de-radicalize themselves from a lot of narratives that are out there. And I think that when people have control over their own history, their own family history, they're a lot less likely to be politicized. And I think that's one way that I'm bringing new tools to people who need them.
And the last word, and to the audience listening.
If you're not, if you're Mexican American or of any background, and you're not yet focusing on genealogy or the history of your own family, give it a try. The stuff you find might surprise you.
And where can they go? What are some of your?
They could just look for me on TikTok, the Tokyo Drifter. They can go to Panes, PANES.info. We have tons of books where you could find your last name, where you might be able to find your last name. And if we do have it, you're going to have, there's a lot of history behind it. And I think, yeah, so check us out at panes.info, or on TikTok, the Tokyo Drifter, or on YouTube, the Tokyo Drifter Mexico. That's what you would be searching.
All right. To the audience, visit Tokyo Drifter on TikTok. Follow him. Check out panes.info. Make your own opinion. Comment on our site here on YouTube. That the interaction, and hopefully those who are watching this, the interaction is meant to inform, whether you agree or disagree, whether there's a perspective that we haven't talked about that might trigger you to do your own TikTok, your own YouTube. And I want to thank Tokyo Drifter for taking the time. He didn't give us a limit or any boundaries to talk about, and it's been very informative. And I want to thank you today, Tokyo, for joining us.
All right, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And don't forget to follow and share, and have a great rest of your day.